4 years is nothing. It's a college degree. It's the time between Olympic Games. It's barely long enough to forget what you had for breakfast on any random Tuesday. But what if 4 years was the exact buffer needed between erasing a civilization and claiming its frozen remains as a fresh discovery? In 1816, the world went dark. They call it the year without a summer. A volcano in Indonesia, they say. Mount Tambora. One mountain, one eruption, and suddenly the entire northern hemisphere experienced crop failures, livestock deaths, and snow in June. The official story is neat. A single geological event explains everything. Except it doesn't explain the uniformity. It doesn't explain why atmospheric disruption appeared simultaneously across continents with no regard for proximity to Indonesia. It doesn't explain the civilization-wide amnesia that followed, the population displacements, the institutional ruptures. Then in 1820, exactly 4 years later, 3 separate expeditions from Britain, America, and Russia, all independently, discovered Antarctica. Same year, same remote frozen wasteland, all operating in the same region within months of each other. That timing should bother you, because Antarctica wasn't unknown. It was unmapped, which is different. Cartographers in the 1500s drew coastlines of a southern landmass with precision that shouldn't exist. The Peary Race map from 1513 shows Antarctica's coastline in detail that matches modern satellite imaging of the subglacial terrain. Not the ice, the rock underneath 2 miles of ice. How does an Ottoman admiral in 1513 map features we didn't confirm existed until the 1950s? He didn't explore it himself. He stated clearly he compiled the map from older sources, sources that are never named, never located, never accounted for. Someone knew. Someone mapped that continent when it wasn't frozen. The Orontius Phineas map from 1531 goes further. It shows Antarctica ice-free, with rivers and mountain ranges and internal geography. Not speculation, actual features that modern sonar later confirmed. These weren't lucky guesses. You don't guess a river system. You don't theorize mountain ridges with enough accuracy that they align with ground-penetrating radar 5 centuries later. You map from observation, which means someone was there. Someone walked that land, charted those rivers, documented those mountains before ice buried everything. The academic response is always the same. Coincidence, artistic interpretation, philosophical symmetry between north and south. They'll suggest ancient cartographers invented a southern continent for aesthetic balance without ever explaining how aesthetic balance produces accurate subglacial topography. The explanation collapses under its own weight. Now consider what happened after 1820. Antarctica gets officially discovered, named, catalogued, and then something strange occurs. Military expeditions. Not small research teams, full-scale operations. In 1938, Nazi Germany launched the Schwabenland expedition. They mapped over 600,000 square kilometers, dropped thousands of territorial markers, and reportedly returned with something that shifted internal priorities at the highest levels. What exactly? The records don't say. They go vague in that specific way records go vague when someone decided the details don't need preserving. What we do know is this. German submarines operated in Antarctic waters as late as 1945. Senior Nazi scientists had documented obsessions with ancient knowledge, lost civilizations, and inherited cartographic traditions. The same maps, the same thread. Then came Operation High Jump in 1946. 1 year after World War II ends, the United States Navy launches a massive Antarctic expedition. Not a research vessel. 13 ships, 33 aircraft, nearly 5,000 military personnel. Led by Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, one of the most decorated officers in American history. The stated objective was scientific research and establishing a base. Maybe that's all it was. But here's what makes the timing impossible to ignore. 3 separate powers across 3 different eras, all following the same maps to the same frozen continent. An Ottoman admiral compiling from older sources. a Nazi expedition searching for something specific, an American military operation arriving immediately after global conflict ended. They weren't exploring randomly, they were following knowledge that predated all of them, knowledge someone preserved across centuries, across the 1816 event, across whatever caused the sky to go dark and the world to freeze simultaneously. And then in 1959, 50 nations signed the Antarctic Treaty. 50 nations agreeing on something is rare. Nations disagree about borders, resources, ideology, language. The 20th century was defined by disagreement, except about Antarctica. Suddenly everyone agreed this one continent needed protection, not from exploitation, from access. The treaty designates Antarctica as a scientific preserve. It prohibits military activity, mineral extraction, and nuclear testing. In practice, it means independent exploration of the interior is functionally impossible. You need logistical support only governments provide. You need permissions quietly difficult to obtain outside approved research parameters. You need infrastructure that doesn't exist for independent travellers. The result is simple. Antarctica is the one place on Earth ordinary people cannot freely visit and investigate. You can climb Everest recreationally. You can cross the Sahara alone. You can sail to the most remote Pacific islands with a small boat and determination. But Antarctica requires a treaty. What needs protecting under 2 miles of ice? The coordination becomes stranger when you look at what happened immediately after the treaty was signed. Within years, research stations appeared. Not one or two, dozens. American stations, Soviet stations, British, French, Australian, all positioned across the continent with remarkable strategic distribution. These weren't thrown together. They required massive infrastructure investments, supply chains capable of operating year-round in the harshest environment on Earth, personnel rotations, communication systems. The logistics alone suggest planning that predated the treaty itself, as if everyone already knew exactly where they needed to be before the ink dried. Why that level of coordination for scientific research? The official answer is climate data, geological samples, studying ice cores to understand Earth's atmospheric history. Valid research, important work. But you don't need 50 nations maintaining permanent bases to study ice. You don't need military-grade logistics for climate science, unless the climate science is secondary, unless what you're really doing is maintaining presence, making sure no one gets too curious about the interior without supervision. I started looking at the research that comes out of Antarctica. Publicly available studies, published findings, the kind of work that justifies billions in ongoing operational costs. Most of it is exactly what you'd expect. Temperature measurements, ice composition, penguin migration patterns, solid science, nothing controversial. But then there are gaps, studies that get mentioned once in internal documents, then never appear in public journals. Research teams that arrive, stay for extended periods, then return without publishing results. Equipment manifests that don't match the stated research objectives. Take ground-penetrating radar. Multiple stations have it. The technology exists to map what's beneath the ice in extraordinary detail. We've used similar systems to discover entire Mayan cities under jungle canopy, to locate archaeological sites buried under desert sand, to map the ocean floor. Yet when you search for comprehensive subsurface surveys of Antarctica's interior, you find fragments, partial scans, regional studies that stop at specific boundaries, never the full picture. The explanation is always funding, logistics, the difficulty of operating in extreme conditions. Fair enough. But we've mapped Mars, we've sent probes to the outer solar system, we've imaged black holes. The idea that we simply haven't gotten around to thoroughly scanning the largest unknown landmass on our own planet starts feeling less like limitation and more like choice. Then there's the restricted zones. Most people don't know this, but certain areas of Antarctica are off limits, even to researchers. Not officially forbidden, just quietly inaccessible. no flights allowed overhead, no ground expeditions approved. The reasons vary depending on who you ask. Environmental sensitivity, protected research areas, safety concerns. But the zones don't correspond to anything obviously sensitive. They're not near active volcanoes. They're not ecologically unique. They're just sections of interior ice that someone decided shouldn't be disturbed. What's there? Probably nothing. Probably just ice over rock like everywhere else. But the pattern of access denial, the careful management of who goes where, it creates questions that wouldn't exist if everything was truly open. Now connect this back to the architecture problem. Those old-world construction techniques appearing globally without documentation. The cities that seem to predate their official founding dates. The infrastructure that shouldn't exist yet clearly does. If we're looking at remnants of a previous civilization, one sophisticated enough to build at continental scale, where would their largest structures be? Where would you place something meant to survive geological timescales? Somewhere stable, somewhere protected from human interference, somewhere that would naturally seal itself over time. Antarctica makes sense, not as speculation, as logic. If you wanted to preserve something through a reset event, through whatever catastrophe ended that previous world, you'd choose the one place guaranteed to freeze everything in stasis. The one place where ice would act as both tomb and time capsule. The Peary Rice map shows rivers. The Orontius Phaneus map shows mountain ranges with precision we didn't achieve until the 1950s. These weren't guesses. Someone walked that land while it was habitable. Someone documented those features before ice covered them. And if they documented the geography, what else did they document? What else is down there? I keep coming back to the timeline. 1816, atmospheric catastrophe. 1820, official discovery. 1938, Nazi expedition. 1946, Operation High Jump. 1959, treaty signed. Each step following the last with uncomfortable logic. As if each generation rediscovered something the previous generation found, then passed the knowledge forward under increasingly strict protocols. The Nazis weren't looking randomly. They had maps. They had specific coordinates. Operation High Jump brought enough force to occupy a small country, not conduct research, and the treaty that followed locked everything down with unprecedented international cooperation. 3 stages of the same process: discovery, investigation, containment. What connects all 3? The same thing that connects the Peary Race map to modern satellite imaging. Knowledge that shouldn't exist yet clearly does. Evidence that someone was there before, documented what they found, and that documentation survived long enough for others to follow. But here's what troubles me most. The silence isn't just institutional, it's cultural. We don't wonder about Antarctica. We don't question why the largest landmass on Earth remained unknown until the industrial age. We don't find it strange that ancient maps show details modern technology only recently confirmed. We accept the official timeline without examining whether it actually makes sense. That acceptance feels taught, like we've been trained not to ask certain questions, not through active suppression, but through absence, by never putting the pieces together in educational contexts, by keeping the anomalies separated across different disciplines where they never touch. The cartography keeps you separate. Ancient maps in one field, modern satellite data in another, Antarctic expeditions filed under exploration history, Tartarian architecture categorized as fringe theory. Nobody connects them because the educational system never puts them in the same room. That separation is structural, not accidental. Think about how we learn history. Chronological chapters, distinct periods, the ancient world, the medieval period, the Industrial Revolution. Each era presented as discrete, self-contained, with clear beginnings and endings. We're never encouraged to look for patterns that span those divisions, never taught to ask whether the breaks between periods might be artificial. What if those breaks were introduced specifically to prevent pattern recognition? Because once you start connecting across disciplines, the official timeline becomes impossible to maintain. The maps showing ice-free Antarctica should prompt questions about when it froze. Those questions should lead to atmospheric science, to climate data, to 1816. That should connect to architectural anomalies appearing globally after 1820, which should raise questions about who built what when. But we're not trained to think that way. We're trained to stay in our lane. The geologist studies ice cores, the historian studies documents, the architect studies buildings, and nobody asks why their evidence doesn't align. I want to show you something specific because this is where the suppression stops being passive and starts looking coordinated. In 1949, Admiral Byrd gave an interview after returning from Operation High Jump, the expedition that brought thousands of military personnel to Antarctica for what was supposedly scientific research. He made a statement that should have generated immediate follow-up questions. He said there was land beyond the pole that held resources and strategic importance. Land beyond the pole, not at the pole, beyond it. That interview exists in archives. You can find fragments of it if you search carefully, but it's never cited in mainstream discussions of Antarctic exploration. Never analysed in official histories of the expedition, just filed away where it doesn't interfere with the accepted narrative. What land was he referring to? The official map shows nothing beyond the pole except more ice extending to the coast. Was he speaking metaphorically? Was he confused? Or was he describing something that subsequent mapping efforts deliberately obscured? I don't know, but the silence around that statement feels familiar. The same kind of silence that surrounds the Piri Reis map. The same silence that greets questions about why architectural styles appear simultaneously across continents with no documented transmission of techniques. Questions that should generate research programs instead generate dismissal. Here's what keeps me awake. If Antarctica contains evidence of a previous civilization, evidence substantial enough to warrant military expeditions and international treaties, then what we're looking at isn't just historical revision, it's ontological disruption. Everything we understand about human development, about technological progression, about the arc of civilization, all of it rests on the assumption that we're the first, that our achievements represent the pinnacle of what humanity has accomplished, that everything before us was primitive, simple, building toward us. If that assumption is wrong, if there was something before that matched or exceeded our current capabilities, then our entire framework collapses, not just historical dates, our sense of position in time, our understanding of progress itself. That's threatening, not to individuals, to institutions, to power structures that derive legitimacy from narratives of inevitable advancement. If we're not the pinnacle, if we're actually rebuilding something that was lost, then the authorities who claim to be leading us forward are actually just rediscovering what someone else already knew. That changes everything, and maybe that's why Antarctica remains locked down. Not because there's something dangerous there, because there's something true there, something that would force us to rewrite not just history books, but our entire conception of what we are and where we came from. The treaty system makes sense from that perspective, not as scientific cooperation, as information control, making sure that whatever exists under that ice is discovered, catalogued, and interpreted by approved institutions before it reaches public awareness, making sure the narrative stays manageable. 50 nations agreeing, 50 different governments with competing interests, all signing the same document saying this one place will remain off limits to independent investigation. That's not diplomacy. That's coordination around shared interest in maintaining a specific version of reality. What would happen if you could just go to Antarctica? If anyone with resources could mount an expedition and start digging? How long before someone found something that didn't fit? Something that proved the maps were right? That the continent was habitable within historical time? That someone built there before the ice came? How long before the questions became impossible to contain? They solved that problem in 1959. made it technically legal to go, but practically impossible. Created a framework where only authorized parties with approved objectives could operate, and then waited for time to do what it always does, make the unusual seem normal. Now we don't even question it. Antarctica is restricted. Of course it is. It's fragile. It's important. It needs protection. We nod along. We accept the reasoning. We don't ask who's protecting it or what they're protecting it from. But you're asking now. And once you start, you can't stop. The timeline is too clean. The coordination too precise. The silence too uniform across too many disciplines. Something is under that ice. Something that connects to 1816, to the maps, to the architectural anomalies, to everything we've been told to keep separate. And they're making sure we don't find it until they're ready for us to know. The evidence doesn't prove anything definitively. That's not how suppression works. You don't destroy every trace, you just make sure the traces never connect. Keep them scattered across disciplines that don't talk to each other. Archive them where researchers won't look. Dismiss them when they surface. But the pattern is there, ancient maps showing what shouldn't be known. A catastrophic atmospheric event in 1816. Official discovery 4 years later. Military expeditions following inherited knowledge. A treaty locking down the one place that might contain answers. And beneath 2 miles of ice, something they mapped when it was visible. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe Antarctica is exactly what they say it is. Frozen wasteland, holding climate data and penguin colonies. Maybe every coincidence is just coincidence. Maybe the coordination is innocent. Maybe the silence is natural. Or maybe 4 years was exactly long enough to let the world forget what it lost before claiming the frozen evidence as something new. You already know which explanation feels true. The question isn't whether something is there. The question is whether you're willing to accept that we've been systematically prevented from knowing what it is. That the largest landmass on Earth remains deliberately unmapped, that the answers are buried under ice and treaties and centuries of carefully maintained ignorance. They froze the past and called it discovery, and we believed them because we were never taught to ask why.